The first topic I want to cover today is the recent oil price crash, and I want to share 3 thoughts about it. So it is currently, this will definitely change in the future in some way, but I'm currently recording this at 9:55 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesday, March 11th, 2020. And I haven't read the news in depth even this morning, but I can't imagine anything is that different. When Don comes on, maybe he'll inform me otherwise if he knows. But I just want to bring you up to date on what's happened. Some of you in the industry will know this very well, but I think it's important to just get the essentials of what is going on with what I'm calling the oil price crash. So, point 1, the price of oil, this is background, is determined by supply and demand, which means the higher demand is relative to supply, the higher prices are, and the lower demand is relative to supply, the lower prices are. So when more people are willing to pay more for oil, then the price goes up, assuming supply stays the same. And if fewer people are willing to pay less, or in effect, people are willing to pay less, then the price goes down. And so in recent years, what's happened is that demand has increased, contrary to the predictions of many people who said it would decrease, but supply has increased far more. And the leading cause has been U.S. shale oil, which has led to falling prices. So again, point 1 is price of oil is determined by supply and demand. Point 2 is that supply has outstripped demand largely thanks to U.S. shale oil. And then point 3 is that these falling prices that come from supply outstripping demand have put a strain on U.S. shale producers who expected more demand and therefore higher prices. And then point 4, in recent months and weeks, demand has gotten even lower because of, you can call it COVID-19, aka the coronavirus, although there are many coronaviruses, which has lessened all economic activity, especially travel, which is affects oil a lot because oil is the fuel of mobility, and then especially in China, which is the world's leading user of energy. So we can think of point 4 as there's a coronavirus-related demand shock. And then the point 5 is in the last several days, government oil companies in Russia and Saudi Arabia, so these are called national oil companies or government oil companies, they control the flow of oil. So it's not at all free property owners under freedom, which exists in the U.S. and to some extent in other parts of the world. So in the last several days, government oil companies in Russia and Saudi Arabia, which many had expected them to keep their supply the same or even cut it, they decided to dramatically increase supply. And there's a whole bunch of interesting things there, but the bottom line for our purposes is that they decided to dramatically increase supply. So that's a supply shock. So you can think of it as we've got a demand shock, demand going down, supply shock, supply going up. And so this is point 6, a low demand shock plus a high supply shock equals plummeting prices as well as expected prices. And then point 7 is plummeting prices and expected prices means far greater strain on already strained U.S. shale oil producers. And then point 8 is we're now hearing predictions of widespread bankruptcy and layoffs. So I have 3 thoughts I want to share about this, and they're mostly for industry, because although I think they're of broader interest and we have a lot of, I've interacted a lot with people in the oil and gas industry, and I have a lot of positive feelings toward that industry. So I have 3 thoughts that I hope will be helpful. But first I wanted to bring on Don, and he raised a good question about how should we think of this as consumers. So first of all, hey, Don, welcome to Power Hour.
Good to be back.
Good. Yeah, it's good to be recording again. So tell us about the question you raised and then your thoughts in terms of how this affects consumers and how we should think about it as consumers.
Yeah, I think that often as consumers, you just kind of hear the bottom line of, all right, prices are down. That's good news. But I mean, if you think from a long range perspective, what you want are enduring low prices that still allow you to get good and ever better products or services. And the way that actually happens, whether it's been from things like computers or cell phones or food, has always been through industry innovation, where they come up with better processes to create all the values that we consume. And are able to do it at lower costs. So they can charge us less and yet still make the profits they need to continue and to expand productive activities. But what, as you pointed out, that's not at all what's happening here. What's happening here is two pieces of bad news, right? So there's one element of it is economic stagnation. And there you could at least say, well, at least we're not paying more for energy at the same time that people are going to be struggling. Some of them are losing jobs. Some businesses are going to see their revenue go down. But then you get to the economic manipulation that is involved from Russia and Saudi Arabia. And there you have to look at like the long-term effects is going to be very destructive on American energy producers. And so the fact that it's temporary and yet is going to cause long-term damage should be something that is really troubling to us, because we're kind of taught to resent whenever we hear about the energy industry's profits. And what you actually want as a consumer so that you can flourish is you want the energy industry and you want every industry that's valuable to be enormously profitable because they're creating something of so much value. And the way that you get that in a way that's not just extracting money from you, but is actually representing the value conveyed to you is through freedom. That is through free companies, privately owned, making economic decisions in the marketplace versus having what we're really seeing right now is foreign policy conducted through energy by these government owned energy, if you want to call them companies. But and that, I think, like, there's no upside to that for us at all. I think there's a very big downside.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And maybe in a future episode, I'll invite on a guest to give more insight into the international cartels, which are currently called OPEC plus. So it involves OPEC, which often involves not only, but many of the Middle Eastern countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, the leading one, and then OPEC plus. It also includes Russia. So that situation has a lot of complexity to it and is probably worth breaking down. But I definitely appreciate Don's point about what we want is low-cost, reliable energy produced profitably, because it's only really low cost if it's produced profitably. If it's low cost, but that doesn't, but people are losing money, then it can't stay low cost for long. And so it's just like if the government subsidized energy, that wouldn't really help much because you would just be that can't endure. And it's not actually low cost because you end up paying more for it, just in a more covert kind of way. All right, so here are my thoughts for the industry. And so the first thought, and I hope this doesn't come across as sappy, but I am really thinking about the really tens of thousands of you that I've met over the years, and it's such a rough situation because it's the coronavirus discussion is very scary. It'll be really interesting to see how it actually evolves. I'm pretty confident that there is way too much panic, but it doesn't mean people shouldn't take precautions. But I mean, that itself is an issue. And then beyond that, the economy in general, you're seeing decline in economic activity when people are not gathering together when they're not traveling, and when goods often aren't traveling. That's just slowing down everything. And so that jeopardizes everyone's future to some degree. And then for your industry to be so challenged, it's particularly scary. So it's just I'm thinking of the many of you that I've met, and then the two other thoughts may be more practically useful. And these I'm not hearing much sympathy in general for people in the oil and gas industry, but certainly not the following. So the second thought is that it's still true that oil use is essential to human flourishing in the coming decades, and therefore it'll likely expand. So it's still true that oil use, and I would say expanded oil use, is essential to human flourishing. And this is important because part of what's contributing to the low prices, particularly the expectation of low future prices and therefore the crash of the stocks, is the idea that oil use will not be essential for very long. And this often goes, I often characterize this as the transition narrative or the extinction narrative. And the basic idea is that humanity should and likely will rapidly reduce fossil fuel use, really rapidly eliminate fossil fuel use, and replace it with renewable energy, above all, solar and wind. So this is the transition narrative or the extinction narrative. And this narrative I talk about in the moral case for fossil fuels, and I've talked about other places. This narrative, I believe, is deeply false. I believe that the true narrative is what we can call the expansion narrative, which is, at least globally, oil and gas use and fossil fuel use more broadly. It should expand, and it likely will expand. And the fundamental reasons reason one is that low-cost, reliable energy is essential to human flourishing, because it gives us the ability to use machines to improve our lives. So that's kind of point one. And point two is that the world is still woefully under-energized or underpowered. You have 3 billion people, for example, as Robert Bryce points out, that use less electricity than an American refrigerator. You have billions of people who are still cooking their food and heating their homes with wood and animal dung. And it's something like, for the average person to consume as much energy as the average American, you need 4 times more energy production. So there's energy is essential to human flourishing, is point one. Point two is far more of it is needed. And then point three is that fossil fuels, and here I'll focus on oil and gas in particular, just because I'm focusing on that industry right now, but they will be by far the lowest cost source of energy for billions of people in the coming decades. There's nothing close to being able to produce low-cost, reliable energy for all the different uses of energy, including mobility, where oil is king. Doing that on a scale of billions of people, there's just nothing even remotely close to that. The closest is nuclear, but that requires massive policy changes in terms of being decriminalized. And you're talking about decades even to build it out cost effectively for electricity, let alone mobility. So there's just the fact, and there's a lot of details here, and we'll talk about the details, and we've talked about them before, but just in terms of the high level fact that fossil fuels will be by far the lowest cost source of energy for billions of people in the decades to come. And then point four is that there are no side effects of fossil fuels that remotely justify eliminating them, that are radically restricting them. And the main one people talk about is CO2 and causing a climate catastrophe. And the point there is there's no climate catastrophe. You can say there's climate change and human beings are contributing to climate change. They have to be precise about what you mean. But in terms of climate catastrophe, which means the threat of mass suffering and death due to changes in climate, there's nothing resembling that. That's a key distinction, I think, for everyone to realize that having an impact on climate, or climate change, if you want to call it that, is not the same as climate catastrophe. And so if you get, low-cost, reliable energy is fundamental, way more of it is needed, the fossil fuel industry is uniquely able to produce it, and the benefits of that far, far outweigh any plausible side effects, then you get to the expansion narrative. We should be using more fossil fuels, not less. And it's also predictive, because those facts that I'm mentioning, that's not just Alex's opinion. These are the facts that people around the world are acting on. Billions of people, despite huge cultural hostility and political opposition to fossil fuels, people are using more fossil fuels than ever. And if they were far freer, they would use far more. China's a really good example. They're building lots and lots of new coal plants while people think, and they're in part using those coal plants to build solar panels or to manufacture solar panels, which are often uneconomic, and certainly uneconomic without coal to produce them. But people have the idea, they're transitioning off. So the higher level point here was that oil use is essential to human flourishing and will likely expand. And I gave you the 4 basic reasons why. This expansion narrative is, I think it's important for everyone to know this, but particularly for those of you in the industry, because it's a positive fact that you are not always being told. And I find that even at companies, people aren't familiar with all the relevant facts in terms of what's wrong with the transition narrative and what's true about the expansion narrative. And so people have an overly pessimistic view of future demand for oil. So and I would just add that those of you who are in the leadership positions, it's very important to tell the true narrative to your employees. And then it's also very important to tell that narrative to investors. And we'll talk more about investors under the ESG subject we'll talk about soon in the next segment. But there's this general phenomenon of investors souring on oil and gas. And part of it is there have been big performance issues, which I'll talk more about that in a minute as well. But I've had even people from very well-performing companies that are very profitable saying, hey, investors have fallen out of love with us. Now, why have they fallen out of love? Well, if they believe the extinction narrative, then even your present success is really illusory, because if your ultimate success, whether you're a good investment, depends on two things: how big your market is, and then how good you are relative to the competition. And if your market is a fast shrinking market that's going to go extinct, it's hard to be a long-term successful company in a really shrinking market. So this point about the expansion narrative about oil and gas. This is crucial to tell to employees, and it's crucial to tell to investors, and to really have all the facts just locked in, because investors often don't have these facts. And this is really the failure to really change or control the narrative in terms of expansion versus extinction. I mean, this is materially connected to stock prices. So this is really something to think about. Even people can say, oh, it's an emergency now, but part of how to deal with the emergency is to give investors the truth about the future of the oil market and not allow this false transition or extinction narrative. So my third thought, and this relates to the expansion narrative that expanded oil use is essential to human flourishing in the coming decades and likely will expand, is that the work you're doing, that you have been doing, is incredibly good. I think this is really important to emphasize for a couple of reasons. One is that there's going to be a lot of criticism of the industry, and not just in the usual ways of destroying the planet, versus I think the reality is actually, no, you're improving the planet. The planet's never been a better place to live, thanks largely to low-cost, reliable energy. But people are going to be saying, of course, you're destroying the planet. But there's also the criticism of the industry in terms of saying, well, the industry has been wasteful. CEO have made mistakes. They've overproduced oil and gas. And surely some of that is true. There have been plenty of mistakes, and those are really important to analyze. But what's not a mistake is the product that you're involved with. It's not a mistake for us to be producing oil and gas, and it's not a mistake to engage in all the innovation that the industry has engaged in. And really what's happened is the industry's mistakes that have, to the extent they've been self-destructive, have still been enormously beneficial to the rest of us, because they've given us more low-cost, reliable energy that we've been able to use to improve their lives. So I hope that those of you in the industry are just during this time just thinking about, okay, we're going to be criticized a lot for what we've been doing and for whether we should do it in the future. And it's just really important to know what we've been doing, speaking for you, is empowering people. And we've just basically given more and more human beings around the world the ability to improve their lives, using the miracle of machines. And you do not want to live in a manual labor world, which 3 billion people still live in. You want to live in a machine labor world where most of your work can be thinking, and you can be far more productive because you can get machines to do most of your work for you. And that's really the empowered world that the industry has created. So those are my 3 thoughts. I hope they are helpful.